Hello, Ludka. Welcome.
Hi Vijaya, how are you doing?
Very well, Ludka. Good to see you. And let's talk about this. What really is an N-400 interview? And could you provide us some tips on how you do that interview?
Yeah, that's very important because it's a last step of immigration cycle. So imagine some people go through immigration for 10, 15 years, and this is the final step. So you want to ensure that everything goes smoothly and properly. So I'm going to just provide some tips, that I see over the years, what's important because it's pretty straightforward and simple application. But sometimes, individuals kind of underestimate this application because this is the last step for USCIS officer, for immigration officer to really review the immigration file. And people sometimes don't think about it, that it's, reviewing the green card file, especially prior visa files. So it's the whole immigration history. So whatever they didn't catch because maybe the system wasn't that great, everything was on paper, that is the time that they will probably catch whatever immigration violation or issue with the entry. So, in my view, this is one of the most important applications. And so tip number one, especially if there was a very complex green card file, it's important to review it. I've seen some horror stories where people were placed in removal proceedings once N-400 application got denied. For example, they were not even aware that it was a fraud involved, by person preparing green card case 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So I would recommend, to review prior files just to see if there is any issue because it's easier to deal with it beforehand that during the interview, some issue will come up. Second, and that's actually pretty interesting, people study so hard for civics questions, the 100 questions, and they're all ready. But, interestingly, even before they get to that point, the officer will review with the applicant the full N-400 application. And especially for the people, where English is not as great and they are worried, that's super important because there are pretty complicated questions, the security questions about genocide and military and arrests. And, I've had one client, for example, that was denied the application because of those questions. The officer felt that the person, even though answered all questions as far as the civics, but didn't comprehend English because they were just trained, the person was just trained to say no. And when the officer rephrased the question from the application, the person didn't understand what it is. So I highly recommend to review the actual N-400 application because the officer will review every question with the applicant. Another tip, if you're thinking to change the name, that is the time during the citizenship. So even if you initially said no, during the interview, you can definitely ask the officer, to change it, that the person decided to change the name. That's definitely the easiest way to change the name. And lastly, just something to remember, after the oath, the person will not have the green card, right? Because they're not green card holders. So remember that once you get your naturalization or citizenship certificate, make sure you apply for the passport. Otherwise, you cannot travel outside of the U.S. And people forget that sometimes. So just some tips, for you to think about. And, of course, once you are citizen, you can vote. So that's something to remember. Remember what we discussed last time, the fees are going up. So now is the time to definitely apply for citizenship.
Thank you, Ludka. Those are super tips to ace the citizenship interview. And of course, thank you for that. And the best counsel and